Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started here. So my name is Eliana Johns, and I am a senior research associate with the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists. And I'm very pleased to be here today to moderate a discussion on this new report that examines the consequences of tactical nuclear weapons use. And I'm joined today by the co-authors, Andrew Facini, Senior Fellow with the Jan E. Nolan Center on Strategic Weapons at the Council on Strategic Risks, as well as Lily Boland, Strategic Foresight Fellow with the Converging Risks Lab at the Council on Strategic Risks. So before we dive in, I want to make a note that we will start off with a moderated discussion, then move to a Q&A portion where I will take questions from the audience. Please use the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask your questions, and we'll address them in the order that they were received. A link to the published report will also be shared in the chat for your convenience, and please feel free to check it out on the CSR website. Really, I think this report comes at a critical time because it reflects one of the major trends that we are seeing in today's shifting international security environment, which is a growing salience of nuclear weapons. And part of that is a renewed interest in the potential use of tactical nuclear weapons to achieve limited warfare objectives, a concept nearly as old as the bomb itself, and one that revives long-standing deterrence dilemmas. Today, nuclear armed states are not only building and investing in these weapons for fighter bombers, attack submarines, and other delivery systems, but they are also making them increasingly easier to employ by updating doctrines to allow use earlier in a crisis. And as this trend grows, some strategists increasingly view nuclear use as acceptable technical means of achieving military objectives, while others see it as a path to catastrophic risk and rapid escalation. And in this greater context, this report challenges the assumptions and highlights the uncertainties behind tactical nuclear weapons use and effects and the responses that might follow. Thus, it calls attention to the need to develop a deeper understanding of these issues to more effectively reaffirm norms for non-use and potentially prepare for possible future scenarios. So with that all in mind, I'd like to turn it over to Andrew to share first how you really defined tactical nuclear weapons for the purpose of this research in particular, and then share some key findings from the report.
Yeah, thanks so much, Eliana. This is a really important topic these days because of the salience that people are giving to tactical nuclear weapons once again. And so the definition is not trivial. The definition is something that we're trying to work with this whole time. Everyone sort of has an idea in their head about what a strategic nuclear weapon is. Of course, the big missiles coming to go and attack cities, the sort of worst imaginations that we had of the Cold War, that's sort of ingrained into the psyche of everybody that's lived through it and beyond. More than that, we have tactical nuclear weapons, which, separate and aside, are notionally meant to be used for the battlefield, right? We define that in the paper that they're best understood to be lower yield nuclear weapons, which means they're lower in terms of explosive power, and they're often stationed or controlled in theater, meaning by battlefield troops and not necessarily strategic forces. And so what this means is that it's a combination definition where you have yield times sort of location and actual ability to deliver it, and range, of course, equally in some sort of context to be used. And so for the cases that we're talking about in our report, when we go through a couple of different versions of whether it's attack against the facility or attack against strictly troops or ships in the field, or as a demonstration shot, the idea that a weapon can be tactical has a lot more to do with the intent and the context than it does with the capabilities. Although the capabilities really do matter, and there's a huge distinction there. So I think with the big tension that we find in this report is that with this being said, with the tactical nuclear weapons being, shorter range missiles, bombs that get carried on shorter range aircraft, sometimes longer range things that can be delivered but with smaller yields. With that being the case, there's a lot to be said about what that means in terms of military capability, and then what that means in terms of political ability in the bigger picture and the strategic ability. And so for us, I think that there's the important part to bring out is that when you're trying to understand these weapons and what it is that they do, what it is that they offer a specific government or a leadership's capabilities in terms of what's going on in the battlefield, what's going on in the strategic situation, you cannot mistake them for strategic weapons. You cannot mistake them for going up the chain. And I think that that's one of the things that comes out when you talk through the effects of them too. If you're talking about tactical nuclear weapons, of course, the technical ability of them to deliver nuclear effects is often on the level of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and not something much smaller. You can go through a different kind of a chart that I often present to my students that shows when you work up from different types of explosions, including industrial disasters like the Beirut explosion, you have a giant scene that's a massive devastation, but it's still an order of magnitude behind where most of these weapons are considered for tactical nuclear weapons. So with those, I think that it sets the stage that you can make the case that these are smaller. You can make the case that these are more deliverable or more usable because they're supposed to be for military use. They're supposed to be for battlefield use and not necessarily the biggest, riskiest, scariest stuff. But there's a ton of risks involved. There's a ton of risks that come from that giant jump in escalation that's born of that capability. And there's a bunch of risks that come straight from the idea that if we start normalizing that, if we start thinking that that is an okay jump, then the rest of that chain after that becomes much more scary. And so I think that's the first thing that comes across in the report, that these weapons are being misunderstood, and that going forward with any sort of strategy requires us to take a really hard look at what that definition means, and then where does it go from there.
Yeah, that's great. And Lily, did you want to add on to anything of the major findings from the report?
Sure. Just I think Andy kind of covered all on the definitions and some of our major findings. I want to emphasize that one of the main objectives in this report is to get across that these are not normal weapons, and especially because we don't have, we only have one kind of use case or precedent to compare effects on, or to compare data from those effects on, or to really assess like the more indirect or like knock-on outcomes from the use of two bombs. So I think if we see that we only have one kind of precedent example, and that in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, those were kind of typically lower yield, or what we consider tactical nuclear weapons yields today, they're still quite devastating and of course horrendous. So I think we tried to really emphasize that this would set a huge precedent in and of itself if a TNW were to be used, since we just haven't had that tactical kind of use case in history, and that's why these are very abnormal weapons, and they shouldn't be necessarily conversed in such a way that tries to attach normality to them or phrase in a way that likens them to like conventional weapons. And that's why we took such a deep dive into not only the immediate effects like within the blast radius, the ionizing radiation and such, and the thermal radiation, but instead also looking at those more indirect effects and taking it a step further and looking at the response pathways. So that's to emphasize just the precedent that this will set. And that's what I wanted to add before we jump into the next part of the conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think something that really stood out to me from the report, but also from your comments as well, is the idea that tactical nuclear weapons, while more limited in nature, still will have these strategic effects overall. So thank you both for that initial commentary. And I'd like to next step back for a moment to actually talk about the broader methodology behind the report. So turning first to you, Lily, could you walk us through this foresight approach and how you see the framework being useful for examining the consequences of tactical nuclear weapons use, and how that methodology shaped the structure of the report itself?
Yeah, sure. I'll start by kind of describing what strategic foresight is. I know that that's in my title. That's kind of my forte, especially at CSR. This report was also developed using a more of a strategic foresight approach. So strategic foresight is a systematic approach to exploring plausible futures. Those uncertainties, those types of future scenarios that you don't want to think about. It's not just trying to look at only the worst case or the best case, but all those cases in between, and expand your ability to conceive of what the future could actually be, and your understanding of different plausible futures. So it involves different tools within its toolkit, such as scenario planning, horizon scanning, backcasting, scenario exercises. And those are really targeted to try and help decision makers prepare for uncertainty, challenge their assumptions about the future, and build more resilient strategies in face of those different plausible pathways so that the future might play out. So foresight is also not about predicting the future. We did not use necessarily forecasting in this report or develop that as an approach for a very specific reason that I'll touch on in a second. But foresight is really about expanding your understanding of what could happen and not just prescribing probabilities or statistics to what is most likely or least likely. It's about trying to just conceive of anything that's plausible, taking in both historic data and present data and looking at kind of emerging trends and risks as well to factor that into your foresight analysis. So when we think about something like a tipping point, and when we talk about climate, for example, foresight is going to prompt us to kind of observe the different signals and evidence in the present that might lead up to a culminating tipping point, so that we can improve readiness and preparedness before we tip into system-wide change. And I think that directly relates to how we think about tactical nuclear weapons and that kind of system-wide change that could happen. If we want to think about the use of a tactical nuclear weapon almost being a new strategic tipping point, similar to how climate has tipping points, and we have no reference for this. So this would actually be a huge tipping point that once it tips over and a tactical nuclear weapon is used, our entire system of deterrence and nuclear security is going to change. And so foresight is going to be a great method to kind of explore what that kind of systematic change or system-wide change could look like. And that's why we endeavor to look at 3 different use case scenarios and keep them quite broad in their context and not ascribe specific regions or countries to them, but instead really boil it down to what are the possible effects and what seems like the most plausible use cases for TNW. So we kind of I was working on a project that was kind of a pilot study on nuclear weapons effects, and that's where the idea of focusing more on the tactical nuclear weapons kind of was born from. And in my research there, I really felt like foresight was absent from a lot of the existing literature on kind of tactical, not just tactical nuclear weapons, but any and all nuclear weapons effects, and that level of research and scientific endeavors into it. It felt like there was a lot of emphasis on data and modeling and simulating these types of effects and different wars of different scales, but not necessarily looking at the lower yield or more tactical level use cases. And because of that gap, I felt like foresight would be a really useful method to try and, 1, address that gap and fill that gap within the existing literature on weapons effects, and 2, really get down to not being bound by data and evidence, but instead it being more of a thought exercise and exploring the plausible futures of tactical nuclear weapons use. So even in the case of a limited nuclear attack, like there will be both local and immediate effects, those direct effects, including physical damage from the weapon's detonation. But we also wanted to use foresight to kind of look a bit deeper into the different state responses and what those escalation pathways could look like. And so that's why foresight seemed like a great approach compared to forecasting, for example, which is trying to ascribe in some level of prediction to the likelihood of a scenario playing out. So we did not focus on that because we wanted this to be more of an exploratory tool or an approach to understanding these mass uncertainties, which foresight is a great method for. 1, confronting how uncomfortable these uncertainties might make policymakers and folks, especially in the nuclear space. It is really hard to get people to think about the future and think past things that seem like a roadblock or something that you can't even conceive of. And so actually putting yourself in that kind of, whether it's a structured brainstorming exercise or a scenario exercise, and actually trying to test your assumptions in more of an experiential method, it is proven to be very successful in getting people to stop only thinking about one case that seems more comfortable for them, or shying away from uncertainty entirely. So this is meant to also prompt a deeper conversation and more literature exploring tactical nuclear weapons, and also the application of foresight as a methodology to doing that kind of exploration further. So that's just a little bit about kind of our reasoning behind it. And for this specifically, we did use scenario planning methodology and horizon scanning from my original pilot research project, which included, a lengthy literature review and kind of a horizon scan of different emerging and recently discussed trends within the nuclear space and rhetoric on tactical nuclear weapons as well, until we actually then developed different scenarios, which was a multi-step process that I can kind of turn to Andy to build on about the 3 scenarios that we landed on. But overall, it did help us paint a better picture and address some of those uncertainties about 3 different outcomes for 3 different scenarios of tactical nuclear weapons use.
Yeah, Andy, if you would want to expand on those 3 scenarios at all, that'd be great.
Yeah, and the idea of applying foresight methods to this type of problem is extremely helpful, because especially in nuclear strategic studies, there's a tendency to kind of approach things in that biggest strategy look, the sort of game board, the big smoky room of like Rand, right? Where like we're trying to about how to get to strategic stability, how to maintain it. And then you can see in there that if you peer downward, you'll get to scenarios that include tactical nuclear weapons use and like the chain of escalation that we sort of talked about. That gets kind of off kilter once you start zooming in on what would actually happen on the day of, right? And so if you take the foresight methods and you look at what a scenario for tactical nuclear use looks like, and you start to first in our report, we start to identify which actual cases might be present these days, what might be plausible, you start realizing that there's a local disaster that's much more of the focus of your concern in the moment than it would be if it were, the classic like 99 Luftballons type of moment where like, oh, it's all happening immediately and then it's over, right? It's not like that in the real world. And in fact, when we talk about our various scenarios, we try to drive directly to like what it is that day, how uncomfortable is that day, how unprepared are we for that moment, and that's useful, right? So in our scenarios, we came up with three main like plausible approaches that we tried to explore. Each have their own different characteristics and different risks. The first was that we talked about tactical nuclear weapons use against a facility. So, for example, an airbase is the right size target for most tactical nuclear weapons. And in theory, it's a military facility. Also true of other types of infrastructure, big earthworks, hardened facilities, things like that. The problem with scenario A in this case is that most of those facilities are near to, by nature or by necessity, civilian areas. And so it's a really tough thing to try to sell this grave escalation while trying to spare, continued and unlimited escalation. You're trying to communicate something by using tactical nuclear weapons. This is, to me, one of the more concerning ones because it's the idea that if you cannot achieve something with long-range bombardment, and we've had a few examples of that in the last year even, people automatically, and we've had documented cases of this, people start asking about, well, what about tactical nuclear weapon? What if a bigger bomb could get the job done? And it's kind of sticking below the level of analysis we need, and it's way below the sort of strategic questions that need to be asked in that moment as well. We also had a second scenario, which is the more classic tactical nuclear weapons are for this scenario, which is use against military forces in the field, right? So the Cold War theory that the Red Army is going to come across Germany and NATO will not be numerically enough to challenge it, so you need to resort to tactical nuclear weapons. The New York Times did a really good write-up of a war game that happened in 1980s about just how crazy this would get. Within the first day, there'd be dozens of tactical nuclear weapons being used across Central Europe. And by the end of day 5, I think it was, they were using strategic nuclear weapons on every capital in Europe, right? Like the chain that gets from there to here is pretty well documented. And that's why we got away from this thing. We got away from these weapons, this first chance we got after the Cold War. But there's still this logic that if you're targeting only military things, including maybe facilities that if you want to argue for scenario A, you can. But if you're targeting military troops, facilities, ships, other things like that, then somehow it's a more viable target. It's a more doable thing, militarily, and you can sort of get away with a giant escalation and maybe control the state of play. And the final scenario we talked about, because it really drives, if you're distilling out those first two scenarios, it's about communication. It's about you're communicating a willingness to escalate badly, right? That's the whole point of going for, the very first line across the nuclear threshold. And that's demonstration. So a couple of, cases from history included, the French theory that if you fielded a smaller, shorter range tactical nuclear weapon, you could use it as the final warning before you go to the strategic level. And that, is an interesting case because a lot of this logic still applies that, in certain contexts, people are calling for, the ability for the labs to direct nuclear testing to show readiness or to show resolve. And that's just not very likely. We see this as something that's going to take a lot more work than it is to say the labs in the United States or, in other countries as well should just be ready to explode a nuclear device kind of on demand. Instead, the more likely way this goes is a live nuclear weapon in the arsenal will get pulled and then used as a demonstration shot. And for these, each of them has different, kind of geographic constraints and different political constraints and different conceptions, but all of them are playing towards this idea that you're trying to do nuclear war. You're trying to have an additional level of escalation, but you're trying to hold something back because you can't just go and, take out your adversary's capital. That's completely different. That's, far over there. But if you're trying to hold it back to a certain degree, there's this nuance that needs to be held. And that to me is extremely risky, to try to just go and try to do that level of escalation while still trying to communicate we're holding back something, even in any of these scenarios, is pretty tough. And so when you go through the next step, which is all of the effects of these weapons, depending on where they are and how they land, it's really, really obvious to me that those effects that go from there and all those scenarios can't just be constrained and can't just be managed just by the say-so or the people who are trying to plan this stuff.
Yeah, that's excellent. I think, Lily, to some of the points that you were making, I saw these scenarios as a really great way to discover and test the assumptions and better understand the range of possibilities projected by the current trends. So I thought the scenarios really did a good job at exposing some of those ideas. And then, Andy, I really appreciated what you were saying about the risks involved, where a lot will depend on, in the scenario where if tactical nuclear weapon is used, a lot will depend on assuming that the message is received correctly. And as you say in the report, and I think is often repeated, the adversary gets a vote, right? So whatever the response might not be predictable per se. There's a wide range of possibilities there. And that kind of leads me to another question for you, Andrew, where the report, as you mentioned, tackles some of these political and technical assumptions and uncertainties. So I was hoping you might be able to draw some of those out a little bit more and talk about what some of those assumptions are specifically and how those shaped your analysis.
Yeah, the assumptions are everything here. And I was kind of shocked when we were writing this up, just how much of this is perception and how much of this is kind of in the minds of the people who are deciding these things, whether you're a strategist or a general or a policy wonk like one of us. Like, it's one of the cases where what you believe about these weapons and what's been said about these weapons and where they are in the world and what the capabilities are sort of thought to be, much less what actually are, has a giant impact on any potential scenario. And so when we go through the indirect effects, right, the effects of a nuclear weapon going off are well documented in a singular case, and we can go through them in the context of what might be those scenarios. But the indirect effects are stuff that we don't really see that much of, right? The disaster response needs for, say, a bomb goes off at an airfield are gigantic and well beyond what most states, areas are ready to, accommodate. You go through the actual outcomes of what happens during the war and what happens if that air base or that naval base or that division is now gone. It does have strategic implications immediately. Like, that stuff needs to be accounted for. But the idea that that stuff is sort of happening on the first hour, the first 12 hours after an attack goes off, the next step is what is going to be the response from the country that was attacked, involved partners and allies, the international community broadly. All of that stuff needs to be figured out kind of at a snap. We don't have a chance to, bring a better context with us. We don't have a chance to get a better international system in gear. It's being tested with the leaders, the structures, the processes that we all have. And so there's going to be a huge fight over what the actual narrative looks like. Those assumptions about what tactical nuclear weapons are, vice a strategic nuclear weapon, are all going to be put to the front, because if you're an attacking nation, you need to say, hey, this was just tactical. Whatever that means, whatever the word just tactical actually shows up like on the ground, you need to start to argue that I intentionally held back a much worse thing that I can do. You're trying to do negotiation along escalation in real time. And it's like you just said, one of the big concerns is that the adversary may not read that correctly. If you're a receiving state, or if you're like, if it's a context where it's like Russia would attack Ukraine, one of the big inputs would be the NATO countries as neighbors, right? Like, that is another factor. The international community all has to read correctly what's being done versus what's being said. And, there's a whole section that we go into here about what's going to happen with crisis communication. Because as we see, every time there's a natural disaster, much less a, actual human-caused war or conflict, the ability for us to get authoritative, clear information is the first thing that goes out the window. And especially if you have an existential interest in distorting what happened, that's going to be one of the first things we see in the modern era. And it's very difficult to imagine a world where nuclear weapon is used for the first time in conflict since, the Second World War, and it's a clear moment for the world. It's a clear-eyed, clear-minded moment for the world to figure this out. You have to test the norms. You have to stand up for things in real time. And to me, that's the scariest thing. It's an immediate check on everything that we've built right now. And honestly, in 2025, a lot of them are trending the sort of the backwards direction.
Yeah, that's really great. Yeah, I think that the element of communication is a really, really important one. And you highlight that in the report with the example on the Beirut port explosion in 2020, which I thought was really, really fascinating. I don't know, could you talk a little bit more maybe about that role of communication and how mis and disinformation play into the scenarios? And Lily, if you have anything to add here as well, I think that was just a really important element that came through a lot of the report.
Yeah, sure. Just quickly too, for those who might remember, in 2020 there was a giant explosion in the port of Beirut, and it was super captured by a lot of people who were filming it because it was a fire for a little while beforehand, and it was a massive dramatic scene, killing about 200 people, injuring about 7,000, causing so much damage in the port of Beirut. What happened quickly though is, this was an industrial disaster. We've seen these before with poorly stored fertilizer. What happened was when all this shocking imagery got out, the first thing that was promoted by virtue of social media and the algorithms and stuff was the shocking nature of it. And the second thing was the conspiratorial nature of what people were trying to add to it. And this all filtered up within the first couple of hours about, lots of right-wing things about Israel, lots of doctored footage showing that there were, and it was actually an attack and it wasn't, a disaster, an industrial disaster. And other people just trying to tie, the big picture together in ways that aren't really true. People claiming that only a nuclear weapon could produce this type of explosion is what really got our attention on this one. But before a lot of this could be cleared up and brought, the sort of long slog of like fact checking, this filtered up to President Trump back in 2020. And he made the off the hand remark to reporters that, wow, it does look like a terrible attack. And he even doubled down to say like, yeah, my generals told me it was a terrible attack. And they had to like walk that back really quickly because of course that wasn't true. And, everyone who was watching this thing could tell that this was an industrial disaster. But this was an example I used. And there was a couple other ones I looked up in the meantime that were including last year's hurricane response, where instead of having authoritative information from FEMA and local disaster recovery in North Carolina get to the fore for people, what was prioritized instead was conspiracies about FEMA's going to take your house and stuff. And that led to people shooting at FEMA workers. Like, this type of disaster moment is ripe for this type of distortion. And if it's filtering up to the level of the president, it's filtering up to the level of heads of state, even if it is, innocuous misinformation, much less, some sort of disinformation campaign. That's a giant vulnerability. And that's this is the exact type of scenario with a tactical nuclear weapon, with the nuance that's involved in it and all the things we don't really understand about it now. That's a huge vulnerability for any country that wants to try to take a cynical take. That's what I worry about a lot, is this communication angle is really, really ripe for distortion.
Yeah, I think what Andy just said really speaks to kind of a core theme explored throughout this report too, which is the converging risks of all of this. And so when you take back to what I said too, of calling this if a TNW were to be used, it's almost like we're tipping over a new strategic tipping point. That's going to cause system-wide changes within the nuclear security system, but also other systems involved. So something like the information environment and communication systems and such are included in that. And when you have the convergence of risks from the weapon's physical and direct effects, and combining with the emergent policy choices and these indirect effects and how those play out, we only have a little bit more certainty when it comes to the actual physical effects from the detonation itself compared to the other two. And so something like just some misinformation are just going to amplify the level of uncertainty we have to be more responsive and not so, or proactive and not so reactive. And going into, why we use foresight for this is to kind of emphasize that level of reactivity that's going to be so immediate and urgent in this type of new precedent that's set. So when you add something in like disinformation, it's going to complicate anyone's ability to respond and manage the unfolding crisis, in addition to trying to get ahead of it. So I think going into trying to think about where this report can be useful, and why again foresight is also a useful kind of methodology for not only checking people's assumptions, but also in terms of resilient and strategic planning. It's going to be useful to think about where mis and disinformation and the information environment comes into play in these three scenarios and any other scenarios people can conceive of that are going to be plausible. And so I think we just have to kind of prepare for that to be a factor, and more of a greater uncertainty that's going to make these existing uncertainties even more riskier and harder to get around. So it's not something to ignore or to downplay at all. It's something to actually factor into any kind of current planning at the moment for any type of risk involving TNW use.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Lily, because the converging part of this was another thing that smacked me right in the face when we were writing this, is that there's so many new things that are happening that are, adjusting how we perceive the news, the day to day, and especially shocking stuff. And so, you had a really good box in the report about the complications about AI in this situation. And there are for sure a ton of different ways we can look at the problems that AI might give to a decision maker. What might happen if AGI becomes like a military applied thing? And there's a lot of things that, we've seen behaviors that kind of show that it's a little bit less, or, a little bit more erratic than humans and stuff. But, the part that I land on in this is that it's not necessarily about any one, technology. There's no silver bullet to try to get us away from strategic thinking and mutual relationship building. It's the perception of all this stuff that has to be maintained. If the perception is that AI is a factor in the decision or the employment of tactical nuclear weapons, that's a giant issue for the rest of the world to kind of figure out, because it's both a dare sort of strategy and escalation, but it is also an attribution inflection of like, well, who are we actually negotiating with in this conflict? And I think that stuff is not well studied, just because it is very scary, because it's not, frightening in the sense of like, oh my gosh, what a possibility. I hope it doesn't happen. It's a possibility of not doing something and specifically bad. It's blurring out the decision-making process. It's kind of it's preventing us from seeing clearly in a moment where that's the only thing that's going to matter. And that's what gets me the most about this converging risk. All this stuff that comes to a head at the exact same moment is going to make it all but impossible for, decision makers to see this all and make the right decision.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it sounds like this idea of the possible integration of artificial intelligence or other emerging technologies, that integration would be also interesting to study in that foresight approach, to look at maybe what scenarios might be more plausible, what other uncertainties might arise, and understanding what more scenarios might come out of that. So that's really great. And Lily, kind of switching gears a little bit, I have another question for you here, just about so the three scenarios that Andy outlined at the beginning, those three scenarios in the report, do you see them differing across regions or potential areas of conflict? You mentioned a little bit about this at the beginning, but in what ways do you see the associated risks overlapping as we apply these potential scenarios to different areas of the world or different points in time? Are there differences, or do things remain the same across those regions?
Yeah, great question. I think, well, they definitely wouldn't remain the same across regions or kind of different countries if you want to plug and play in our scenarios, because we did not necessarily ascribe any kind of country or government to these use cases. They were more broadly references to hypothetical uses based on the tactical nature of these types of weapons and what they're intended to use for. So any kind of impact, or whether it's in a different region or by a different government, is going to depend on the yield, the location that they're used, even things down to like the weather and how that difference is across regions, because that's going to be a major factor. And so no matter what, there's going to be incidental damages that's going to create knock-on effects that are not well understood. And so I think that's more or less what we're trying to explore with having these three scenarios be a bit more broad and not regional specific. It's just that there are way too many uncertainties too across different countries, and we don't have enough. I mean, this is something that a lot of the scientific studies on nuclear weapons effects to date explore more of the regional to large scale conflicts. And when I say regional, I'm talking even more than like 25 weapons detonated on each side of the conflict. So it's quite a large scale scenario that they're often assessing in those studies, and a lot of them are quite restricted in terms of the data that they can access. Again, we don't necessarily have use cases in modern history to be able to reference and pull data from to see how the explosions play out, but we can observe fires and different types of other weather events or natural disasters or explosions, and take city data from different cities, though it might not be the exact city that you're trying to model. So there's a lot of gaps in the data side as well that scientists are actively working to try and remedy. And they do get extremely close and precise in what they can model in terms of those effects. But instead, for our three scenarios, we weren't trying to get to that level of granularity necessarily. We were trying to make these a bit more broadly applicable to different contexts. And still emphasize that a lot of this boils down to the yield, the location, the type of detonation, the weather, and if, just geographically speaking, if there's civilian infrastructure, cities and towns nearby, it's going to make those incidental knock-on effects like even more amplified. If this isn't just an attack against military forces in the field, for example. So our three scenarios, the use against a facility for the first one, the use against military forces in the field for a second one, and demonstrative uses of TNWs, all kind of also poke at what are different acceptable levels of risk. And I think we definitely pick that up throughout the report, and that's something that was really apparent in my preliminary research as well, is that there's this unspoken kind of narrative on where governments see their risk tolerances and their adversaries' risk tolerances. And I think this type of scenario exercise or thought exercise is really useful to try and understand, like, and lay out all of the effects in one go and all of the uncertainties in one go, to then better understand where your level of risks that you accept lie at. And so, oh, sorry, my dog just knocked something over. Well, that's a mess for later. But yeah, so basically looking at, we can never be 100% accurate to any of these, even if we do pick a specific regional location or like a very, very specific scenario. And so that's why we wanted to look at more what are the likely unintended or intended effects. And that kind of came out a lot in the military forces in the field scenario too, which is that, there could be some intentionality behind having those knock-on effects be more intense, if that is like kind of the focus of using TNW in that type of scenario. And then comparing that to like the demonstrative use of TNW, for example, that does also have a huge intentionality of it to be a show of force, to be a proof of concept, and to escalate in that way. So I think the escalation pathways and the ways that that's also affect deterrence and how we see kind of that escalation ladder playing out is also something that we explored throughout the scenarios, and I think is not regional or country specific either. Again, we're dealing with a massive amount of uncertainty, so I think it's useful to tap into that a little bit, but not to the extreme where we're trying to be prescriptive. Again, this wasn't a forecasting exercise; it was a foresight exercise. So we were just trying to look at all the different plausible ways that these effects could play out, and also trying to be a little bit more agnostic to how these can differ in different contexts, which is why we really went into detail in the escalation pathways as kind of a third level of effects there that hasn't necessarily been explored as much in the literature on weapons effects.
Yeah, that's excellent. And it kind of dovetails into another question that I'll pose to both of you, maybe just more generally, what throughout your research, what have you kind of seen as pressing areas that require further research on, tactical nuclear weapons, or maybe their use in modern conflicts? And how do you see open source research in particular, such as that you were doing in this report, how do you see that playing a role in advancing the understanding? I mean, you both talked about there's gaps, there are a lot of uncertainty and assumptions, there are areas where there could be more data, where people are working on these issue areas, but are there certain pressing areas that you see as requiring further research, something that you would maybe be excited to tackle?
Oh yeah, all of them. Everything you could possibly think of needs more study on this, because I mean, in the big picture, we're straight up in an ordering moment, right? Like the world order, the beliefs and the norms that we've held on to for a really long time are all being discarded in some way or another. And so that leaves a lot of questions about, like, when we inherit a generation's worth of nuclear weapons and we're trying to build different types of them from the previous generation, what does that mean? And so I don't think there can be enough questions about what would happen if, or enough questions about what are the effects of, or enough questions about, specifically just even straight up which weapons systems do we need? And that doesn't need to just be thoroughly interrogated. It needs to be put into context for what it is the risks we're building to build. I think Lily said this earlier. When you build into your arsenal a certain type of weapon and a certain type of capability, it doesn't even have to be nuclear weapons, it doesn't even have to be weapons in general, but when you build into your state power a set of capabilities, that gives you certain things you can do, but it also buys you a certain amount of risk, both in terms of how you're communicating this, what it costs to you to maintain it and to shepherd that capability, but also what your adversaries will see that as, because it takes another level of maintenance just to say what it is we do. That's why the United States and other countries put out nuclear doctrines. Like, we need to be clear about what these things are for. This is a question everyone's been asking since 1945. And so when we get down to it, we can't just discard all of the sort of bilateral beliefs, norms, agreements, things that we've done without a clear-minded sense of what it is that we're trying to do. And so when it comes to tactical nuclear weapons, we're trying to do something really specific. We're trying to enter into a lower part of the ladder of escalation, this theory that if an adversary is going to come and escalate to a certain degree, that there will be a credible option to respond. Now, this is probably where TNWs make the most sense, is in this theoretical realm where it's like, yes, we're working our way up toward nuclear deterrence, and we should find at every level of that ladder that you probably shouldn't keep going. So, if that's true, then yeah, I can see where you get to the idea that you can't go without a tactical nuclear weapon, in theory. But in practice, these are actual things that go into actual arsenals, that go into actual hands of people. And that means that it needs to be communicated, it needs to be shown to be differently. And so far, we're seeing a lot of different communications about intermediate range systems. We're seeing a lot of communications about the role of nuclear war. We're seeing Russia doing too many, examples of nuclear brandishing. All of this stuff is eroding the norms that led everyone to conclude back in the 90s that these were a particular type of weapon that only accelerated the risks. And I think that your question about open source information towards all this stuff is really important, because one of the things that we believe really thoroughly is that the public should be able to understand this stuff enough to have thorough and concerted input to this. It's not necessarily about building a grassroots to march 1 million people in Central Park, although I do think that probably would help into certain problems. It is a matter of access, and there's a lot of forces, both sort of inertial forces from the old days, but also like the forces of people who want to try to convince you to build these weapons, that say certain people can't be involved in these conversations. Certain people don't know enough, certain people don't have enough interest, and it's really, to me, the biggest hindrance we have towards building a clearer idea of security all across the board, from climate security that we work on here at CSR, to the weapons that we're trying to talk about here on this report, to all sorts of things we see, at the local level. The access is important, and the ability for everyone to talk clearly about this stuff and be informed is just as important. And we need to keep doing this type of work.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for that answer. And Lily, is there anything that you wanted to add before we turn to audience Q&A?
Yeah, I think on that point of open source, and also to what Andy was saying about these as options and acceptable levels of risks and all of that, is going back to the initial goal of, or one of the big outcomes of my initial pilot research was that, when the US president is presented with nuclear options in some sort of conflict or crisis situation, he's not also presented with a list of the direct effects and indirect effects that could play out. It's more or less focused on the immediate kind of warfighting situation and whether or not the US is going to achieve its strategic or tactical objectives with that weapons choice. And so in that moment, which is a very high intensity, a closed door situation room, very fast decision making, it would be nice if there was coupled with the nuclear options an explainer or a one pager on their maybe unintentional risks that could accompany them, to then inform that decision as to whether or not this is the best pathway forward, or if the intended effect could also be achieved with a conventional weapon. And I think something like our report, and why we had these 3 scenarios detailing 3 very, very different but somewhat similar in their unintended consequences or knock-on effects scenarios, is that hopefully this will start more of a dialogue on, and specifically a publicly accessible dialogue on the types of effects and their importance in articulating them in a crisis situation. And I think that's just something that's kind of absent from our decision making at the moment. And that's been evidence from different interviews that we've done or conversations we've had and kind of articles published on this stuff, is that there's just not a comprehensive overview provided in that situation room. And I think even before it gets to that kind of crisis level, there needs to be more of an open dialogue within strategic and tactical planning to consider these effects at scale and prioritize them as needing to be managed, and whether and have that prompt a question as to whether or not a TNW is really necessary to consider, or if, again, the intended effect can actually be achieved with some other conventional weapon in our arsenal, since we have so many. So that's just one point I wanted to emphasize before we turn it over to the Q&A.
Yeah, and there's a long history, it's like a storied history of presidents and premiers and whatever getting absolutely scared the crap out of by getting their nuclear briefing, right? Reagan reportedly was terrified of doing his nuclear briefing, and after that, it really changed his perspective. That's crazy. I think it was also Yeltsin couldn't finish doing it. He was like too shaken about making sure it was not real. Like those guys, first of all, that's kind of crazy on its own, but those guys had the understanding of, broad scale nuclear war thing. My big worry is that we're kind of forgetting the fact that now we might be looking at a world where people are trying to figure out a way to do it just a little bit. And then that won't be scary. That will have normalized by then the concept that this isn't the full thing, this isn't the real deal, so you can go ahead and do it. And so I think to what Lily's saying is like, now is the time to start talking about all of these things ahead of time, bringing it forward and making it work. That to me is the work right now, making sure that people understand what it is we're talking about. The first recommendation we have is understand these weapons better. And it's not just because we want to, be able to tell people more about them. It's because that is what needs to be in the minds of people as they approach these subjects.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you both so much for those responses. I think now is a really great time. We have a few questions to turn to in the Q&A. And just a reminder to the audience as well, if you have any questions, please insert that into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I think, Andy, you actually answered a few of these in your remarks that you just gave a few minutes ago. So foresight. So I'll jump here to a question on how did your research on the potential use consider the use on a nuclear armed state versus use on a non-nuclear armed state?
So this is interesting because we talked a little bit about this before, but the report is a bit of a Rorschach test for what you're currently working on, right? So we were originally writing this report from a perspective of, we were responding to the threats that Russia made against Ukraine back a couple of years ago. And the idea there was exactly what you're saying, the use of nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear state. Now, that changes a lot of the dynamics, the things that we talk about in the report about like an international system response, but it doesn't change the full thing. I do hold that if the United States, China, or Russia use nuclear weapons on a non-nuclear state, that would cause an international crisis just the same. It would be different players and it would be different networks of interested, groups. But to me, the rest of this would play out because regardless of where it happens and how it happens, and even if it was, between nuclear states and it was kind of a clean nuclear war, whatever that means, if it goes down that path, then I think you also have the problem of the norm is gone. And for 75 years, the norm against using nuclear weapons was a really useful tool, not just for keeping a lid on things and making it a real, an actual safe, peace building focused world, yada yada. It was also a tool of statescraft. You were able to put pressure on certain countries. You were able to make sure that military balance is kind of within the realm of mostly conventional with a nuclear backstop. That worked for as far as it goes. It wasn't equitable, it wasn't fair, and it wasn't, something that could be sustained probably forever. But at least it was more stable than a world where tactical nuclear weapons are seen to be okay, and we never fully define what that means, and we never fully defined who gets to use them. And I definitely don't want to live in a world where if Russia were to use it against Ukraine or China were to use it against the US or something like that, and it stood and things mostly went on the way they were, the risk of any conflict having an even more of a foot in the door towards mutual annihilation, that's bad. We should avoid that. It's maybe a long way of saying that's bad as a point to make, but yeah, it's still risky even against a non-nuclear state.
Yeah, Lily, did you have anything to add before we jump to the next question?
Yeah, I think I'm getting flashbacks to when we were writing the thing itself and having this conversation about really what to call the escalation and response pathways section too. And I think a lot of like this question really speaks to it, to why that was so important to add, building on what Andy just said. And it gives more rise to using the scenario methodology again to look at this exact kind of use case. So I think this question is also like another scenario to explore, which would be really interesting to kind of detail on a bit more. And I think adding on another layer to it, speaking to like our why this is such a systems issue as well, is like if you add in AI or AGI kind of military integration in the future and then the near term, if that happens, what if it's a non-AGI equipped state versus an AGI equipped state that also has nuclear capabilities? So like there are these constant like layering that we can do to try and arrive at, managing for these greater uncertainties that are coming out because of technological developments, and also the way that we do warfare has dramatically changed and will dramatically change with the advent of AI. And so I think looking at armed or not armed in terms of not just weapons capabilities, but also technological capabilities will be a huge another kind of report to come out, or exploratory scenarios to explore further. So yeah, just speaking to why this is such an important kind of thought exercise to keep doing.
Yeah, you kind of teed up the next question I was going to ask here, where we had a few members of the audience kind of wanting to dig a little bit deeper into this question of new technology. So Lily, if you want to continue expanding on that, do you have anything else to say regarding how new technologies, whether it's AI or something else, might usher in more of this normalization of tactical nuclear weapons when it comes to delegation of launch authority or integration into NC3, how some of that stuff might play into these scenarios, or how it might affect the normalization of the use or consideration of use for tactical nuclear weapons.
Right. So I think we have a box in the report kind of poking at this a little bit. Again, it's more prompting like a whole nother research endeavor, which I think is bound to happen as AI advances, especially as it advances maybe potentially towards AGI, right? So if we think about AGI and military integration, which hasn't happened yet, if militaries and countries start to actually integrate advanced artificial intelligence or artificial general intelligence and across their military capabilities, whether that's automation only in certain areas or throughout. And it's kind of hard to discern as to like what the most applicable uses are yet, and what countries are feeling in terms of like their, again, appetites when it comes to like acceptable levels of risk with military integration with AGI. So I think all those things are again, more and more uncertainties that something like Foresight can help try and get a hold of at present. But just speaking to when it comes to automation, for example, like is a human kept in the loop in that scenario or not? That's going to come out with two very different outcomes if they're kept in to that point, or if nuclear codes, for example, are like given to a machine. So I think that was like in the original war game movie from the 80s, is that everything, all the nuclear codes, everything was given to the automated machine that also did the war games and such. And that's like our kind of worst case scenario that could play out. But there's a lot of other scenarios that aren't necessarily that worst case. Though I do think it's important to explore too, the concept of like emergent behaviors with AI systems is something that I'm increasingly concerned about, especially as we get to different layers of automation. And so if we think about nuclear launches, or who's given the right to launch is given to an AGI system, for example, and they determine that it makes sense to use a tactical nuclear weapon, and let's say that that's never been used before. Again, these are just like more scenarios that are left unanswered but should be explored. And I think as technology develops, we're going to have more and more of these like potential scenarios to actually dive into and try and conceive of in present before they even happen. And I think our three scenarios too, just one final point, because I know that we have a few more questions in the chat, but our three scenarios are also really great analogs, but they're also, to me, kind of things that maybe AI systems, if they are in control of some level of nuclear capabilities, might think are very plausible and worthwhile use cases for them to actually deploy TNWs for. So the kind of attacking infrastructure or military forces, those more tactical and like what conventional weapons are typically used for, who's to say an AI system won't perceive the risk as very low because it's not necessarily attacking civilian infrastructure. That's not the intended goal or effect, but maybe it's not accounting for the response pathways or the kind of political and diplomatic effects that could happen as knock-on effects. So I think it's just a lot of uncertainties with AI, a lot of uncertainties with its advancement to AGI, and again, to the next level of how that's integrated. But I think our scenarios really can be expanded and have those add-ons built into them to try and see what an AI system might perceive as the most plausible or worthwhile use case, and work backwards from there to figure out how to actually like build that into AI systems to not just default to something that seems very low risk, and to actually consider those more indirect and knock-on effects and escalation pathways. But I'll see if Andy wants to add anything on before I turn it back over.
Yeah, I mean, we did a lot to make sure that we're really clear in these examples, that we're not trying to make a blueprint. We're trying to show what the big vulnerabilities are right now. And I think that it's an easy jump to take those and say like, oh yeah, they are useful against an airfield size target or something like that. And I do worry about the instructions given to an artificial intelligence that will make recommendations or even commands. Like that's an active concern that wasn't true a couple of years ago. And I will point out too that there has been the nuclear history we have is replete with examples where a human was the reason we didn't obliterate ourselves, right? The Arkhipov incident, the Petrov incident, those are both men who were supposed to, by orders and by the parameters they were given, recommend or launch nuclear weapons and potentially start World War III. And they didn't, because in the end, like I said, so much of this is a perceptual game. What are we actually doing is something that cannot just be conceptualized in terms of like the prompt and parameters you give to an AI. It cannot be held under one, military standing order ever. It's always within context. It's always within the day-to-day. And at the end of the day, it's a human problem. You need a human to be able to go in there and say, this isn't right if it isn't right. You can't just go ahead and say, oh, well, it follows this, it achieved a certain score on the general intelligence, and so there you go. So I worry about that too increasingly, but even more proximate to us maybe is the idea that AI is going to just simply misinform the people who are actually making decisions. Even if we never turn the keys over to a computer, having all of the people qualified to work on this stuff be sort of kept up by the parameters of what AI can provide and the limitations of what all that does to a human. I think that that's another risk that needs to be explored even further. It never needs to get to the point of AGI for us to all sort of be co-opted in that way.
Yeah, I really appreciate your answer, and I think that ties in really nicely to what Lily was saying, and just about this foresight approach being a great way to test some of the trends, test the assumptions, and explore whether it's integration of AI, whether it's new kinds of technologies being introduced to the situation. There are so many possibilities, so exploring those and testing the bounds of what is possible is just really valuable when it comes to these issues where, as Lily also you said, we don't really have a lot of historical data to back up what responses might be. So it just adds to the uncertainty and adds to the risks that we'll be having to deal with more and more in the future. So unfortunately, it puts us right at time. So we didn't get to your question. We had quite a few, so my apologies that I feel like we could talk about this for another 3 hours. But I'll just say, please do check out the report at the Council on Strategic Risks.org. Give it a read. It's really interesting whenever you have a chance. So I'd like to go ahead and thank our panelists for such thoughtful and engaging discussion, and also to the audience. Thank you for your attendance and excellent questions. So thank you all, and have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Eliana.